The story of the American Revolution does not begin with muskets firing at Lexington or the ringing words of the Declaration of Independence. It begins years earlier, in the uneasy aftermath of the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. In 1763, Britain stood as the world's most powerful empire. Its red-coated soldiers had defeated France and claimed vast new lands stretching from Canada to the Mississippi River. Yet victory came with a cost. Britain's war had doubled the national debt, and London looked across the Atlantic toward its colonies as a source of revenue to ease its burden. For many in Parliament, it seemed only natural. The war had been fought in part to protect the colonies. Should they not help pay the bill? The first spark of discord came not with taxes but with land. In 1763, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The goal was to prevent conflict with Native American tribes, but to colonists eager for fertile land, it felt like a betrayal. Thousands had fought in the recent war with hopes of claiming land in the West. Now, a royal decree barred them. Farmers, speculators, and restless frontiersmen simmered with anger. This was the first sign that Britain's vision for its empire and the colonists' vision for their future were drifting apart. If land restrictions planted the seed of resentment, taxes watered it. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring colonists to purchase official stamps on documents, newspapers, contracts, even playing cards. For the first time, Britain sought to raise direct revenue from the colonies rather than regulate trade. The response was explosive. Colonists argued that only their own elected assemblies had the right to tax them. The rallying cry became "no taxation without representation." Across the colonies, protests erupted. Effigies of tax collectors were burned in the streets. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. In Boston, the Sons of Liberty harassed officials and forced stamp distributors to resign. Confronted with such fury, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act the following year. Yet the crisis left scars. Colonists had discovered their power to resist imperial authority, while Britain had discovered the colonies could be dangerously defiant. The repeal of the Stamp Act was not the end, but the beginning of a deeper struggle. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, placing duties on imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. Once again, colonists resisted, organizing boycotts and smuggling goods to avoid British control. Tensions rose further when Britain stationed troops in colonial cities to enforce order. In Boston, red-coated soldiers patrolled the streets, a daily reminder of imperial power. On March 5, 1770, this simmering resentment boiled over. A mob of angry colonists confronted British soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs, stones, and insults flew. The soldiers, pressed against the wall, opened fire. 5 colonists lay dead on the frozen street. Patriots called it the Boston Massacre. Though only a handful had died, the incident was seared into memory as proof that Britain's rule was turning tyrannical. Even as blood was spilled in Boston, Parliament attempted another compromise. Most of the Townshend duties were repealed, but the tax on tea remained. To the British, it was a matter of principle. Parliament must maintain its right to tax the colonies. To Americans, it was proof that the danger of tyranny remained. In 1773, the conflict exploded in a dramatic act of defiance. When the East India Company attempted to unload taxed tea in Boston, colonial patriots disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded the ships under cover of night. They smashed open 342 chests of tea and poured them into the harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not a dispute over a beverage, but a declaration that colonists would not bow to Parliament's will. Britain's response was swift and harsh. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts in America. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was repaid. Massachusetts lost its charter and fell under direct royal control. Town meetings were restricted, and British officials accused of crimes could be tried in England rather than in local courts. For colonists, These acts felt like a direct assault on liberty. Boston became a city under siege, its people defiant but strangled by imperial punishment. Yet what Britain intended as punishment instead forged unity. Across the colonies, from Virginia planters to New England merchants, sympathy poured toward Massachusetts. Colonists who had once quarreled among themselves now saw that if Parliament could strip rights from Boston, it could do the same to any colony. In September 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. For the first time, men from distant provinces met as Americans rather than merely Virginians, New Yorkers, or Bostonians. They debated their response carefully. Few sought outright independence yet. Instead, they petitioned the king, demanded the repeal of the intolerable acts, and organized new boycotts of British goods. But underneath these cautious steps, a deeper resolve was forming. The colonies would stand together. The seeds of revolution were thus sown not in a single moment, but in a chain of grievances and responses. Britain sought revenue and control. The colonies demanded rights and liberty. Each measure by Parliament brought stronger resistance. Each protest by the colonists invited harsher punishment. From the frontier lands of the Appalachians to the crowded streets of Boston, the air was thick with suspicion, anger, and hope. By the close of 1774, neither side yet desired full-scale war, but the path of reconciliation was narrowing. The king saw rebellion in Boston. The colonists saw tyranny in London. Between them stretched an ocean of misunderstanding, and soon an ocean of blood. By the dawn of 1775, the American colonies stood on the brink. A decade of protests, petitions, and boycotts had failed to reconcile their grievances with the British Crown. The First Continental Congress had adjourned with cautious optimism, urging unity and resistance but still professing loyalty to King George III. Yet across New England, militias were drilling, gunpowder was being stockpiled, and whispers of war filled taverns and town halls. Britain, determined to assert authority, had dispatched more soldiers to Massachusetts. In Boston, General Thomas Gage, the royal governor, sat with thousands of redcoats, watching a countryside simmer with defiance. Both sides awaited the spark that would ignite the fire. That spark came in April 1775. British authorities, fearing colonial unrest, sought to seize weapons stored in Concord, a town outside Boston. On the night of April 18, hundreds of redcoats marched under cover of darkness, but the colonists were ready. Thanks to a network of riders, including Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, the alarm spread across the countryside. The regulars are out. Church bells rang, drums beat, and militiamen known as Minutemen grabbed muskets and marched to meet the enemy. At dawn on April 19, British soldiers arrived in the small village of Lexington. There, a line of armed colonists waited. A tense silence gripped the air until suddenly a shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. No one knew who fired it, but it unleashed chaos. The British opened fire, killing 8 colonists. The revolution had begun. From Lexington, the redcoats marched on to Concord, where they destroyed supplies but soon faced hundreds of armed patriots. At North Bridge, the colonists fired back, forcing the British to retreat. Along the road back to Boston, militiamen poured from farms and woodlands, harassing the retreating column. By nightfall, nearly 300 British soldiers were dead or wounded. The myth of British invincibility was shattered. Across the colonies, news spread like wildfire. Blood had been shed, the Rubicon had been crossed. The following weeks transformed New England into a battlefield. Tens of thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston, beginning a siege of the city. While the British controlled the harbor, the countryside belonged to the Patriots. Yet the colonists lacked unity of command. Each colony's militia answered to its own leaders, and discipline was uneven. It was clear that if this was to become more than a rebellion, they needed an army. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Delegates debated fiercely. Some, like John Adams, called for bold action. Others, like John Dickinson, still hoped for reconciliation. In the end, Congress took a decisive step. They created the Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. Washington, tall, dignified, and already a veteran of the French and Indian War, brought with him not only experience but also unity. His Virginian origins symbolized that the struggle was not merely New England's fight but the cause of all America. Even as Washington traveled to Boston to assume command, the first major battle of the war erupted. In June 1775, British forces under General Gage sought to break the siege by seizing the high ground around the city. Colonial militias fortified Breed's Hill, mistakenly remembered as Bunker Hill. When the British advanced, the colonists, low on ammunition, waited until the redcoats were almost upon them before unleashing devastating volleys. Twice the British were driven back. Only on the third assault, after the colonists exhausted their powder, did they take the hill. Though technically a British victory, the Battle of Bunker Hill came at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded, compared to some 400 colonists. The message was clear. This would not be a quick war, and the colonists would fight fiercely for their liberties. Through the summer of 1775, the siege of Boston dragged on. Washington worked tirelessly to impose discipline, organize supplies, and transform a patchwork of militias into a functioning army. At the same time, Congress made one last attempt at peace. In July, they sent the olive branch petition to King George III, affirming loyalty while pleading for redress of grievances. The king, however, rejected it outright and declared the colonies in open rebellion. With that rejection, reconciliation was dead. As the war spread, so did revolutionary ideas. In January 1776, a pamphlet appeared that electrified the colonies. Written by a radical Englishman named Thomas Paine, it was titled Common Sense. In fiery language, Paine argued that monarchy was tyranny, that America owed no loyalty to a king an ocean away, and that independence was not only possible but inevitable. Selling more than 100,000 copies within months, Common Sense turned the tide of public opinion. What had once been whispered in taverns was now shouted in town squares. America must be free. The momentum for independence grew stronger as 1776 unfolded. Battles continued around Boston, but in March, Washington achieved his first major triumph. Thanks to captured artillery hauled from Fort Ticonderoga by Colonel Henry Knox, the Continental Army fortified Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston Harbor. Faced with American guns commanding the city, the British had no choice. On March 17, 1776, they evacuated Boston, sailing for Halifax. For the first time, the colonies had expelled the king's army from one of their cities. Yet the struggle was far from over. Britain was preparing a massive invasion, assembling fleets and soldiers to crush the rebellion once and for all. The colonists knew that to face such a storm, they needed not just armies but a nation. In June 1776, the Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, the young Virginian, took up the pen. His draft spoke of universal rights, that all men are created equal, that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these rights, the people have the duty to alter or abolish it. After heated debate and revisions, the Congress adopted the document on July 4, 1776. The Declaration of Independence was more than a statement of grievances. It was a revolutionary proclamation that America was no longer a collection of colonies but a free and independent nation. Copies were sent across the world, and in town squares throughout America, the words were read aloud to cheering crowds. Bells rang, soldiers fired muskets in salute, and the people rejoiced. Yet celebration was tempered with fear. By declaring independence, the colonies had crossed a point of no return. If they lost, they faced not compromise but destruction. Thus, by the summer of 1776, protest had become war, and war had become revolution. From the first shots at Lexington to the soaring words of Jefferson, The colonies had transformed their struggle from a defense of rights as Englishmen into a fight for freedom as Americans. The world had changed. 13 colonies now stood together, defying the greatest empire on earth. Ahead lay years of hardship, defeat, and sacrifice, but also the hope of liberty. The American Revolution had truly begun. The Declaration of Independence had been signed, and the bells of liberty rang across the colonies. But celebration soon gave way to grim reality. Britain, enraged by the act of rebellion, was preparing a massive military response. The mightiest empire in the world would not allow its colonies to simply walk away. As summer turned to autumn in 1776, British ships darkened the horizon, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. The American Revolution had declared its ideals, but now it had to survive. The storm broke in New York. In July 1776, General William Howe landed on Staten Island with over 30,000 British troops, including German mercenaries known as Hessians. Facing them was George Washington's Continental Army, a force of barely 20,000, many poorly trained and poorly supplied. Washington sought to defend New York, a vital port and symbol of American resolve. But in August, at the Battle of Long Island, the British struck with overwhelming force. Washington's lines crumbled, and only a daring nighttime retreat across the East River saved the Continental Army from destruction. In the months that followed, Washington was driven from New York entirely. The Redcoats occupied the city, and Washington's ragged soldiers retreated through New Jersey, cold, hungry, and disheartened. For many, it seemed the revolution was collapsing. The crisis deepened as enlistments expired. Men who had signed up for a year were eager to return home, unwilling to suffer further defeats. Washington knew that without a bold stroke, the cause would wither. That moment came on Christmas night, 1776. With snow falling and the icy Delaware River before them, Washington led 2,400 men in a daring crossing. They marched through the freezing dark, surprising a Hessian garrison at Trenton on the morning of December 26. The attack was swift and devastating. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, defeating another British force. These victories, though small in scale, breathed new life into the Revolution. The image of Washington, resolute and unyielding, crossing the Delaware became a symbol of American courage. Still, the struggle remained desperate. Through 1777, the British sought to crush the rebellion by severing New England from the other colonies. General John Bergen marched south from Canada with a large army, aiming to meet Howe's forces advancing north from New York City. But Howe chose instead to capture Philadelphia, the revolutionary capital. In September, at the Battle of Brandywine, Washington's army was defeated, and Congress fled the city. Philadelphia fell to the Redcoats, leaving the Continental Army battered and morale shaken once more. Yet while Howe triumphed in Philadelphia, Bergen's campaign unraveled. His advance southward was slowed by dense forests, supply shortages, and relentless American resistance. Militia forces under leaders like Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold harassed his column, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. At Saratoga, in October 1777, the Americans struck decisively. Bergen's army was surrounded and forced to surrender nearly 6,000 men. The victory at Saratoga was a turning point of the Revolution. For the first time, the Americans had defeated a major British force in open battle. The news resounded across the Atlantic, convincing France that the American cause was not doomed but destined. As diplomats like Benjamin Franklin worked in Paris to secure alliances, Washington's soldiers faced a more immediate trial. In the winter of 1777-1778, the Continental Army encamped at Valley Forge outside Philadelphia. It was a season of unimaginable suffering. Nearly 12,000 men huddled in crude huts, lacking shoes, blankets, and food. Disease ravaged the camp. Men marched with bloody footprints in the snow. Desertion and despair threatened to tear the army apart, but Washington remained steadfast, his presence a source of inspiration. "We must all hang together," he reminded his officers, "or assuredly we shall all hang separately." Out of this crucible of hardship emerged new strength. At Valley Forge, the Prussian officer Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived to train the Continental soldiers. With strict drills, discipline, and organization, he transformed the ragged army into a force capable of facing the British on equal terms. By the spring of 1778, though thinner and hardened by suffering, Washington's army was sharper, stronger, and more determined than ever. Meanwhile in Europe, Franklin's charm and wit had borne fruit. The French crown, persuaded by the victory at Saratoga and eager to humble Britain, formally entered the war in 1778. With France came supplies, money, troops, and, most crucially, the French Navy. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now a global war. Britain faced not only the defiance of its American colonies, but the power of France, and soon Spain as well. Yet survival was still not assured. The revolution remained fragile, its resources scarce, and its soldiers unpaid. Loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the crown, fought alongside British troops. Native American tribes seeking to defend their lands often allied with Britain against the colonists pushing westward. Slavery, too, divided the revolution. Enslaved African Americans saw opportunity on both sides, with some joining the British in hopes of freedom, while others fought for the Patriots. The revolution's promise of liberty was not yet universal, and its contradictions loomed even as muskets fired and drums beat. By 1778, however, the tide was slowly shifting. Washington's army, once on the verge of collapse, now stood more capable than before. France's alliance promised new hope. The revolution had endured its darkest hours and survived. Still, the struggle for independence would rage on for years, through new campaigns, betrayals, and victories yet to come. The cause of America was not secure, but it was alive. And for the first time, perhaps, it seemed possible that liberty might triumph over empire. The revolution was no longer a fragile spark. It was a flame that refused to be extinguished. The entry of France into the American Revolution in 1778 transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into a global war. No longer was Britain simply struggling to suppress distant subjects. It was now battling powerful European rivals eager to humble its empire. For the Americans, French alliance brought hope, supplies, and the promise of naval power to challenge British dominance. For Britain, it meant war on multiple fronts, stretching its armies and fleets across the globe. Yet even as the revolution expanded, the struggle in America remained brutal, uncertain, and filled with shifting fortunes. The first test of the renewed Continental Army came in June 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey. Washington, leading his reorganized troops, sought to strike General Henry Clinton's army as it retreated from Philadelphia toward New York. The battle unfolded under scorching summer heat, with soldiers collapsing from exhaustion. At first, confusion among American commanders threatened disaster. But Washington, riding into the fray, rallied his men with fiery determination. The battle ended as a stalemate, yet it proved that the Continental Army, hardened by Valley Forge and trained by Baron von Steuben, could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. The long retreats and humiliating defeats of earlier years were giving way to resilience and resolve. Meanwhile, the war spread far beyond American shores. In the Caribbean, French and British fleets clashed for control of sugar islands worth fortunes in European markets. In 1779, Spain entered the war as France's ally, further straining Britain's resources. Spanish forces attacked British positions in Florida and Louisiana, while in Europe itself, Britain faced growing diplomatic isolation. The American Revolution had become a piece of a vast struggle between empires, with the fate of nations entangled in the fight for liberty across the Atlantic. Back in America, the British shifted their strategy. Having failed to crush the rebellion in the North, they turned to the South, where they believed Loyalist support was stronger. In late 1778, British troops captured Savannah, Georgia, and soon launched a campaign to dominate the Carolinas. In May 1780, Charleston, South Carolina, fell after a long siege, delivering the worst defeat of the war for the Americans. Thousands of Patriot soldiers were captured, and British confidence soared. They seemed poised to reclaim the South and choke the Revolution from its weaker flank. But the Southern campaign proved more difficult than Britain anticipated. While redcoats could seize cities, they struggled to control the countryside. Patriot militias, led by men like Francis Marion, the Swamp Thomas Sumter, waged relentless guerrilla warfare, striking supply lines, ambushing detachments, and disappearing into swamps and forests. The brutal conflict pitted neighbor against neighbor, with loyalists and patriots locked in bitter civil war. Farms were burned, families torn apart, and atrocities committed on both sides. The Revolution in the South was not only a clash of armies, but a savage struggle that consumed entire communities. The tide began to turn in 1780 and 1781. At the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780, frontier militiamen crushed a force of loyalists, shattering British hopes of rallying widespread support. Then, in January 1781, General Daniel Morgan led a stunning victory at Cowpens, where American forces used clever tactics to rout a larger British army. These victories revitalized the Patriot cause in the South and weakened British control. Yet challenges remained. In 1780, the Revolution was rocked by the betrayal of one of its most celebrated generals, Benedict Arnold. Once a hero of Saratoga, Arnold felt unappreciated and burdened by debt. Secretly, he conspired with the British to surrender the key fortress of West Point on the Hudson River. The plot was discovered, and Arnold fled to the British, becoming a symbol of treachery. His name would forever be synonymous with betrayal, yet his actions underscored the Revolution's fragility. Despite setbacks, American fortunes improved as French support grew. In 1780, thousands of French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau arrived in Rhode Island. Together with Washington, they began planning decisive operations. The French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, prepared to challenge Britain's naval supremacy. For the first time, the Americans had allies capable of matching Britain's global might. By 1781, the focus of the war shifted to Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis, after campaigns in the Carolinas, moved his army north to establish a base at Yorktown, a port town on the Chesapeake Bay. There, he believed the Royal Navy could supply and protect him. Washington saw an opportunity. With French coordination, he devised a bold strategy. Instead of attacking New York, the longtime British stronghold, he would march his army south to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. It was a gamble, but the pieces fell into place. French forces under Rochambeau marched with Washington, while Admiral de Grasse sailed from the Caribbean to blockade the Chesapeake. In September 1781, at the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French Navy clashed with the British fleet and won control of the bay. Cornwallis was trapped, cut off from reinforcements and escape. Washington's gamble had succeeded. The stage was set for the final act of the Revolution. The global nature of the war, from the Caribbean seas to the forests of the Carolinas, had brought Britain to a breaking point. The empire faced rebellion in America, enemies in Europe, and challenges across the seas. The American Revolution, once thought a minor colonial uprising, had become a test of imperial endurance. And in a small Virginian town, the fate of that empire and the dream of American independence would soon be decided. The year 1781 began with uncertainty. The war had dragged on for 6 long years, testing the endurance of both armies and the patience of entire nations. Britain still occupied New York and Charleston, while much of the countryside smoldered in civil strife between patriots and loyalists. American finances were in ruins, the Continental Congress nearly bankrupt, and Washington's soldiers still often went unpaid. Yet despite these grim conditions, there was a sense that the tide of war was shifting. The French alliance was bearing fruit, and the British, stretched across the globe, struggled to hold their gains. In this fragile balance of power lay the opportunity for a decisive blow. That opportunity came in Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis, after campaigns across the Carolinas, had brought his army northward. Hopping to secure a defensible base of operations, he fortified the small port town of Yorktown on the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis believed the Royal Navy could supply and protect him, making Yorktown a stronghold for future campaigns. But this decision would prove fateful. It placed his army in a vulnerable position. If the bay could be sealed off, Cornwallis would be trapped. In the summer of 1781, George Washington faced a dilemma. For years, he had dreamed of retaking New York City, the greatest British stronghold in America. With French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau now marching alongside him, the chance seemed near. Yet Washington was pragmatic, and when he learned of Admiral de Grasse's fleet sailing toward the Chesapeake, he recognized the greater opportunity. If the Americans and French moved swiftly, they could converge on Cornwallis, trap his army, and deliver a crushing blow. The plan was daring. Washington and Rochambeau would march their combined armies, more than 6,000 troops, from New York to Virginia in secrecy, while de Grasse's fleet blocked the British Navy. In August, the armies began their long march southward, their movements cloaked in deception to keep the British in New York guessing. Along the way, they were joined by more troops, swelling their numbers to nearly 17,000. Farmers and townsfolk watched in awe as columns of soldiers, both American and French, passed through their villages, drums beating and banners waving. It was a sight that symbolized not only unity, but also the growing might of the Revolution. Meanwhile, Admiral de Grasse arrived off the Chesapeake with 28 French warships. In early September, the British Navy under Admiral Thomas Graves sailed to challenge him. The Battle of the Chesapeake erupted in the waters outside Yorktown. Cannons roared and masts splintered as the two fleets clashed. When the smoke cleared, the French held firm, their blockade unbroken. The British withdrew, leaving Cornwallis isolated. For the first time in the war, Britain's naval supremacy had been checked in a decisive moment, and it sealed Cornwallis's fate. By late September, Washington and Rochambeau had joined forces with the Marquis de Lafayette's troops already shadowing Cornwallis in Virginia. The Allied army surrounded Yorktown, digging trenches and constructing siege lines. The French Navy ensured no reinforcements could arrive. Cornwallis, with some 8,000 men, was trapped. The siege began in earnest on September 28, 1781. The scene around Yorktown was one of relentless intensity. By day, Allied troops advanced their siege works closer to the British defenses, digging trenches under constant musket fire. By night, they hauled artillery into position. Cannons thundered, shells arced through the sky, and British defenses crumbled under the bombardment. Washington, overseeing the operations, personally ordered the first American cannon to be fired, symbolically beginning the bombardment that would decide the war. French artillery, well supplied and expertly manned, joined in, unleashing devastating fire. The sky above Yorktown glowed red with flame and smoke. A pivotal moment came on the night of October 14. The Allies targeted two key British redoubts, earthen fortifications that anchored Cornwallis's defenses. Washington ordered a daring nighttime assault. American troops, led by Alexander Hamilton, stormed Redoubt 10 with bayonets, while French soldiers attacked Redoubt 9. With fierce determination, the Americans scaled the walls, fighting hand-to-hand in the darkness, and captured the position in minutes. The French likewise triumphed. These victories sealed Cornwallis's fate, as the Allied siege lines now pressed directly against his inner defenses. Inside Yorktown, conditions were dire. British soldiers, exhausted and short on supplies, endured constant bombardment. Buildings collapsed, men were killed in their sleep, and morale plummeted. Cornwallis, desperate, attempted a nighttime evacuation across the York River, hoping to escape and regroup. But a sudden storm scattered his boats, forcing him back. The trap was complete. On October 17, Cornwallis requested a ceasefire. Negotiations followed, and on October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown and surrendered. The scene was solemn and symbolic. British troops, their drums beating a slow march, stacked their weapons between lines of American and French soldiers. Cornwallis himself, feigning illness, did not attend the ceremony, sending his second-in-command instead. Washington, dignified yet resolute, stood at the head of the victorious Allies. The war was not officially over, but the British defeat at Yorktown was so complete, so decisive, that its political consequences were immediate. News of the surrender spread swiftly across America. Church bells rang, towns erupted in celebration, and soldiers embraced. After years of defeat and despair, the Revolution had delivered its greatest triumph. Across the ocean, the news stunned Britain. Public support for the war collapsed, and political leaders began pressing for peace. The mighty empire, drained by years of conflict and now humiliated by defeat, was forced to reconsider its course. For the Americans, Yorktown was more than a military victory. It was the fulfillment of years of sacrifice, hardship, and hope. Farmers who had left their plows, merchants who had risked their fortunes, soldiers who had endured freezing winters, all saw in Yorktown the promise of liberty realized. For Washington, the triumph was deeply personal. He had endured defeats, doubts, and betrayals, yet he never abandoned the cause. At Yorktown, his perseverance and leadership were vindicated. Though skirmishes would continue and formal peace would take nearly 2 more years, Yorktown marked the effective end of the Revolutionary War. The dream of independence, once fragile and uncertain, now stood within reach. America, forged in struggle and sacrifice, had proved that even the most powerful empire could be defied. On that autumn day in Virginia, beneath the thunder of cannons and the flutter of banners, a new nation's destiny was sealed. Yorktown was not merely a battlefield victory, it was the birth cry of the United States of America. The cannons at Yorktown had fallen silent, but the echoes of revolution still reverberated across the world. With Cornwallis's surrender in October 1781, the war was, for all practical purposes, won. Yet the revolution was not over. The British still held New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, and fighting smoldered on the frontiers. Diplomats in Europe wrestled over terms of peace, and in America itself, the greater challenge lay ahead: how to transform victory into a functioning nation. The struggle for independence had succeeded, but the struggle for governance was just beginning. In the months after Yorktown, George Washington urged vigilance. He cautioned against complacency, reminding Congress and his army that Britain was not yet beaten. Indeed, smaller clashes continued. British raids struck Virginia and the Carolinas, while Loyalist and Native American allies fought bitterly against Patriot settlers on the western frontier. But the will of Britain to continue the war had collapsed. The conflict had drained its treasury, stretched its armies thin across the globe, and divided its people at home. Parliament began pressing for negotiations. In Paris, American diplomats Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay engaged in delicate bargaining. The French, eager to see Britain weaken, supported American independence but also sought to advance their own interests. Spain, too, had ambitions in North America. The Americans, wary of being pawns in European politics, pushed firmly for recognition of their sovereignty and secure borders. After long negotiations, the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. The terms were remarkable. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and granted boundaries stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from Canada to Florida. For a fledgling republic, these vast lands promised opportunity, but also new conflicts yet to come. As peace dawned, Washington faced one of his greatest tests, not on the battlefield but in the halls of power. His soldiers, unpaid and weary, grew restless. In 1783, at Newburgh, New York, whispers of mutiny stirred, with some officers considering marching on Congress to demand their wages. It was a dangerous moment, one that could have shattered the revolution from within. Washington confronted his officers directly, delivering a heartfelt appeal. Taking out a pair of spectacles, he admitted, "I have grown gray in your service and now find myself growing blind." The simple gesture moved his men to tears. The crisis passed, and Washington's authority was preserved, not by force but by moral example. Later that year, Washington made another extraordinary decision. On December 23, 1783, he resigned his commission before Congress in Annapolis, voluntarily surrendering power. In an age when victorious generals often crowned themselves rulers, Washington returned to his farm at Mount Vernon. His act stunned the world. King George III is said to have remarked that if Washington truly retired, he would be the greatest man in the world. In that moment, Washington set a precedent that the American Republic would not be governed by military might, but by civilian authority. Yet independence had not solved America's internal struggles. The new nation was bound together by the Articles of Confederation, a framework adopted during the war. The Articles deliberately created a weak central government, fearful of tyranny. Congress could not levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce laws effectively. States often acted as independent countries, printing their own money and pursuing conflicting interests. Debt mounted, and soldiers and farmers alike grew frustrated with the lack of stability. This weakness became clear in 1786, when farmers in western Massachusetts, burdened by taxes and debts, rose in rebellion. Led by Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution, they marched on courthouses to prevent foreclosures. Shays' rebellion, though eventually suppressed, shocked the nation. It revealed the fragility of the Republic and the urgent need for stronger government. For many leaders, including Washington, the chaos confirmed that the Articles of Confederation were failing. In 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia to address the crisis. What began as an effort to revise the Articles soon became something far more ambitious: the drafting of a new constitution. For 4 months, the delegates debated in secrecy, wrestling with questions of representation, power, and liberty. Large states and small states clashed over influence. Northern and Southern delegates argued over slavery and commerce. Compromises were struck, including the infamous Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved people partially for representation, a decision that foreshadowed deep divisions in the future. The result was a bold framework unlike any seen before: a federal republic with checks and balances, a separation of powers, and a system designed to prevent tyranny while ensuring effective governance. The Constitution created a stronger central government, but one accountable to the people through elections. In 1788, after heated debates, the required 9 states ratified the document. A new nation was born, not merely independent but united under a written constitution. Still, questions of liberty remained unresolved. Enslaved African Americans, Native Americans, and women were excluded from the promises of the Revolution. The contradiction between the ideals of freedom and the realities of inequality lingered, shaping the struggles of generations to come. Yet in the eyes of the world, the American experiment was revolutionary, not just in war, but in governance. The idea that a people could overthrow monarchy and create a republic, based on the consent of the governed, inspired movements across Europe and beyond. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. Standing on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, he took the oath of office, pledging to serve not as a king, but as the head of a government accountable to its citizens. The Revolution, once a fragile rebellion, had given rise to a functioning nation. The legacy of the American Revolution was not merely the creation of the United States, but the birth of ideals that would echo across centuries. It demonstrated that empires could be defied, that liberty could be claimed, and that governments could be built upon the will of the people. Yet it also left challenges unresolved, ensuring that the work of freedom would continue long after muskets fell silent. From the blood-soaked fields of Saratoga to the humble halls of Philadelphia, from the snowy misery of Valley Forge to the triumphant surrender at Yorktown, the Revolution was a story of endurance, sacrifice, and vision. It forged a nation from 13 quarrelsome colonies, proving that out of struggle, unity could be born. And so, in the years after 1781, America took its first steps, not simply as a collection of former colonies, but as a nation. Fragile, imperfect, but free. The American Revolution was more than a war. It was the birth of a nation, a struggle that reshaped the world and left behind ideals still resonating centuries later. From its first sparks in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War to the creation of a constitution that endures to this day, it was a story of endurance, sacrifice, and vision. The roots of the revolution lay not only in taxes and trade, but in ideas. When Britain sought to tighten control after 1763 through the Stamp Act, townshend duties, and restrictions on westward expansion, colonists resisted not just the costs but the principle. No taxation without representation became their cry, an assertion that political legitimacy must rest on consent. Protests turned into defiance, defiance into rebellion, and rebellion into war. In April 1775, muskets cracked at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world signaled that America's quarrel with Britain could no longer be contained in petitions and debates. Within months, the Continental Army, under George Washington's command, faced one of the most formidable empires on earth. It was a lopsided struggle, poorly trained militias against disciplined redcoats, a fragile Congress against Parliament's treasury, and a scattered people against one of history's great powers. Yet resolve, resilience, and a vision of liberty drove the patriots forward. The war's early years were marked by both disaster and triumph. Washington's retreats across New York seemed to foreshadow collapse, but his daring crossing of the Delaware and victory at Trenton revived the cause. In 1777, the Battle of Saratoga brought a turning point, an American victory so significant it persuaded France to join the fight. What began as a colonial uprising was now a global war, with Britain battling France, Spain, and even the Dutch across oceans and continents. For soldiers, the revolution was endured as much as it was fought. The winter at Valley Forge tested Washington's men to the limit, yet from that crucible emerged a more disciplined army, hardened by hunger but trained with new skill. The revolution was also fought in homes and communities, where loyalists and patriots clashed in brutal civil wars, and Native Americans and enslaved Africans were drawn into the conflict, often with tragic consequences. It was a war of ideals, but also one of survival. The Southern campaigns, beginning with Britain's capture of Charleston, seemed to threaten American hopes. Yet guerrilla leaders like Francis Marion, victories at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, and the stubborn resistance of militias showed that the British could seize ground but not hold hearts. Meanwhile, treachery emerged in the form of Benedict Arnold's betrayal, a reminder that the revolution balanced constantly between triumph and disaster. The final act came at Yorktown in 1781. Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and the French Navy under de Grasse encircled Cornwallis, cutting off his escape by land and sea. After weeks of bombardment, the British surrendered. Bells rang, soldiers wept, and Americans dared to believe what once seemed impossible: independence had been won. But the revolution did not end with muskets stacked at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 secured recognition, granting vast lands stretching to the Mississippi. Yet victory revealed new challenges. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak to govern effectively. Unrest flared in Shays, rebellion, and the dream of liberty seemed at risk of dissolving into chaos. The revolution had secured freedom from Britain, but could Americans govern themselves? The answer came in Philadelphia in 1787. There, delegates crafted a constitution unlike any other, a framework of checks and balances, separation of powers, and government by consent. Ratified after fierce debate, it created not just independence but unity. In 1789, George Washington became the nation's first president, embodying the ideal of leadership by service, not domination. The revolution had not merely broken chains, it had forged a republic. Yet contradictions remained. The revolution proclaimed liberty, but enslaved people remained in bondage. It declared equality, but denied political rights to women and many men without property. Native Americans were pushed aside, their lands increasingly threatened by expansion. The American Revolution was not a complete realization of its ideals, but it set the foundation for struggles that would continue for centuries. Its legacy was profound. Across the Atlantic, revolutionaries in France looked to America for inspiration. In Latin America, movements for independence found hope in the idea that empire could be resisted. The revolution proved that a people could defy monarchy and found a nation on principles of liberty and consent. It was a message that reshaped the modern world. The American Revolution was, at its heart, a human story of farmers leaving their plows to take up muskets, of merchants risking fortunes for a cause, of women managing homes and businesses while men marched away, of soldiers shivering in the snow yet refusing to surrender. It was a story of leaders like Washington, Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson, but also of countless unnamed patriots who endured hunger, fear, and loss so that a new nation might be born. From the protests in Boston to the surrender at Yorktown, from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, the Revolution was both a war and a beginning. It did not perfect liberty, but it lit a flame, and that flame, once kindled, could not be extinguished. The American Revolution ended with more than the creation of a new government. It ended with an idea that freedom, however fragile, is worth the fight, and that a people, united in purpose, can shape their own destiny.